Good evening, everyone. My name is Janet Dolan, and I am a founder of the Minnesota Peace Initiative. And I'm your host and your moderator for this evening. And first and foremost, on behalf of the Norway House and on behalf of the Minnesota Peace Initiative and our planning committee, I'd like to welcome all of you to this evening's program. I just was lucky enough to return from a trip to Bhutan, up in the, as they say, the high Himalayas of Asia. And when you arrive at Bhutan, they give you a white scarf. And they put it around your neck, and they say, we hope you have, first of all, welcome. We're glad you're here. We hope you have a wonderful stay in Bhutan. So I say the same thing to you. If I could, I would put a white scarf around all of your necks and tell you that we're very happy you're here, and we hope you have a very good evening tonight. We have a great program for you. Probably the first thing that anybody has to say is the election is over. And all I can say is, regardless of how you felt about the results of the election, I hope that we've all gotten beyond it. And our goal tonight is to turn the page and now to focus on the future and take a longer range view than, for most of us, just getting through November 8th. Interestingly enough, our topic tonight actually builds on the election. Our topic is the rise of nationalism and the threat of a renewed nuclear arms race. It builds on the election because the Brexit vote, the election of President-elect Trump, the potential election of Le Pen in France, the potential defeat of the upcoming constitutional referendum in Italy. These are all signs of the rise of nationalism around the world. Nationalism can be defined in many ways, but largely it is promoting more of a singular focus on what's good for your country and less of a focus on also considering the well-being of other countries and peoples. When we selected the topic several months ago, we had some skeptics, even within our own committee, and you may have had the same reaction when you saw the title of the program. And that is, there is a rise of nationalism, and there is a renewed arms race, but are those just two separate phenomena? Do they just operate in parallel, or is there really a connection? That is the question our panelists tonight will address. For any of you who are attending the first time, and I've met, I hope, many of you, and I know there are some of you here for the first time, let me tell you a little bit about who we are and why we do these programs. The Minnesota Peace Initiative is part of the Norway House. Norway and our Norwegian ancestors have a long tradition as peacemakers. Norway is often a trusted, neutral global partner asked to help resolve differences and to bring parties in conflict to the negotiating table. Therefore, as part of the Norway House, we seek to provide a forum for thoughtful discussion of current issues and conflicts, where we can listen and learn from each other. And again, this brings up the election, because how many times in the election did we hear, we just need to listen to each other more? This is an opportunity to do so. The goal of the Minnesota Peace Initiative is to delve deeply into challenging global issues of our time. We believe a well-informed electorate is essential for an effective democracy. We bring you experts to share their knowledge and insights so that we can become better informed about important, timely issues. As you can see from our banners, some of the topics that we have addressed in the past include Islam in the West, Arab Spring, divisions in the Ukraine, the impact of social media on world events, and how educating women and girls creates stability in emerging nations. Tonight, we will begin with a brief statement from each of our participants on their particular expertise. Dr. Robert Kelley from American University will address the rise of nationalism. Mr. Tom Collina, Policy Director of the Ploughshares Fund, will speak on the arms race. Following their opening remarks, I will moderate a discussion between them, and then we will conclude with an audience Q&A. And your questions are very important to the success of our programs. So we hope you will take the cards that are provided and write your questions on them. We will collect them, and I will review them, and then we will try to get to as many of your questions as possible. Before we introduce our panelists, I want to just give you a quick, what I would call Cook's tour of the concept of nationalism, as well as a brief history of the global arms race to date. Nationalism arose in the mid-18th century England, at least the concept or term, and it was an effort to get citizens to identify more with their country and less with smaller units in their life, such as family, town, or region. A country's sense of nationalism tends to ebb and flow depending upon what is going on in the world. When there's a high reliance on interconnections between countries through alliances or the creation of common interests, you will often see blocks of countries working together for a common set of goals. However, when countries become disillusioned with alliances or with working with others, or they become fearful of immigration or other threats to their borders, you see a rise in nationalism, which sometimes can reach the point of hyper-nationalism or even isolationism. Since World War II, we have been in a period, some refer to it as the Cold War, some refer to it as the battle of the superpowers, but whatever you called it, it was the time of very low levels of nationalism and high levels of global alliances and identities. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall and of the Soviet Union, we have seen 20 years of rising nationalism. This nationalism does not necessarily always follow geographic borders. As we've seen in parts of the Middle East and in Africa, many of the national borders that were drawn after World War I by the superpowers of that day are now breaking down. Ethnic, tribal, sectarian conflicts have emerged. They are still a form of nationalism because they are one group looking out for itself and feeling threatened by those near them who are not of the same identity as they are. We heard a lot about identity politics in our recent election. We hear a lot of anti-immigration concerns in many countries of the world. This is part of nationalism, which is an identity that draws people together and then creates fear of those who don't share your same identity. We clearly are now in a period of rising nationalism, whether it's within well-defined national borders or within historic, ethnic, or religious sects or groups. The concept of an arms race is not new. Countries have long sought to get the newest and the greatest weapon to either defend itself or to attack its neighbor. I read a lot about ancient civilizations. The invention of the chariot, the shield, the bow and arrow, and gunpowder were, in their day, the newest and greatest weapons. There was a race to either get the weapons or get the natural resources needed to make the weapons. You wanted to get the new weapon before your enemy got it. In our lifetimes, the newest and greatest weapon is, of course, the nuclear bomb, or some version of it, such as a dirty bomb or germ warfare or some other equally destructive force. Coming out of the 1950s, when children thought that they might have to climb under their desks at any moment because of the risk of a nuclear war, major nuclear powers came to the table to begin disarming. This was orchestrated through negotiated agreements among nation states with nuclear weapons. So we came through the 90s, thinking it was the end of the Cold War, the end of the Soviet Union, and thus the end of the arms race. However, here we are 20 years later, facing what some experts feel may be a new arms race, not just among superpowers, but among rogue nations, among ethnic and sectarian groups, or among small nations sharing a border with an enemy. Our panelists tonight will not necessarily make us feel safe or secure, but they will ensure that we leave more knowledgeable about the new arms threat, how real it is, and what policies and actions we and other countries can take to cool this possible renewed arms race. Let's turn to our experts and begin our program. Our first panelist is Dr. Robert Kelley, Associate Professor, School of International Service at American University in Washington, D.C. He earned his PhD in International Relations at the London School of Economics, his Master's on International Peace and Conflict Resolution at American University, and his BA in the International Relations at Tufts University. He teaches courses on intercultural communication, peace and conflict resolution, and diplomacy. He's written extensively in his field. His current research is on power and activities of individual and non-state actors in world politics. This is the subject of his 2014 book, Agency Change, Diplomatic Actions Beyond the State. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce to you Dr. Kelley. Dr. Kelley, will you come up and take a seat? Mr. Tom Collina, Director of Policy at Ploughshares Fund, which is in San Francisco, has his degree in international relations from Cornell University. He brings 25 years of Washington, D.C. experience in nuclear weapons, missile defense, and non-proliferation issues. Specifically, he has worked to rationalize anti-missile programs, extend the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and secure Senate ratification of the New START Treaty. He was the co-founder of the Institute for Science and International Security. He was the director of Global Security Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and he also was the research director of the Arms Control Association. In 2014, he joined the Ploughshares Fund as its director of policy. He has written extensively on the subject of arms control. He appears regularly in national media, and he briefs congressional staffs on the topic. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to bring to you Mr. Tom Collina. We're very pleased to have Dr. Kelley and Mr. Kalina with us this evening. And I'm going to open the program, as I said, with each of the panelists giving you just a brief statement of kind of their perspective on their part of the this evening's topic. And I did, in my opening, assure them that they would address this question that I raised earlier. Is there a rise of nationalism? And if so, is it connected to the renewed arms race? So I'll turn it over, first of all, to Dr. Kelley, and then I'll just hand it over to Mr. Kalina. But each of them is just going to give you their perspective, not only on our topic in general, but that specific question. You have a mic right there.
Hi, good evening. Thank you. Thank you, Janet, for this wonderful invitation. Thank you to the Peace Initiative and Norway House for this warm welcome and this timely and important conversation, tying together two things of high import in the world right now, nationalism and nuclear proliferation. So I guess we'll follow the preset rules here, and I'll deliver my nationalism bit. Hand it over to Tom to give you the good news about nukes, and try to keep it as upbeat as we possibly can. First off, an apology. I was given great advice by a mentor years ago that I should never preface remarks with an apology. because it just sends the wrong message, that you're already getting up on stage and you're backtracking from something you haven't even said yet. But I'll say, under the current circumstances, being a political scientist in an unpredictable political environment, I think we have a warranted reason now to apologize, because political scientists everywhere were wrong about what's going on right now. We didn't foresee the wave of nationalism that's sweeping through the West. We didn't foresee the Arab Spring. We didn't foresee a lot of the resurgence in the nationalistic tendencies that are sprouting up. That is because we are really poor predictors of the future. I don't know if you picked up on that by now, but we are not very good at telling you what's going to happen. What we are good at doing is looking at the debris of a political change, sorting through it, and making sense of it. So when it comes to nationalism, we really haven't been on the mark about this, arguably, since Karl Marx talked about the Communist Manifesto in the 1840s, and 70 years later, boom, we have Russian Revolution, and Karl Marx suddenly looked like a very smart man, even though he looked smart before that too. I want to take it away from Karl. This, I think, is the track record that we face right now, is somehow explaining nationalism in a world where the outgrowths and the emergence of nationalism are often very hard to see coming. So that's the first thing to take note of. How did we get here? The new nationalism, so named for the novelty of the populist revolt against the establishment that's captivated the West, needs to be distinguished from previous drivers of nationalism. They're not all the same. What we're in the midst of right now is the latest iteration in a long series of nationalistic forces that have emerged in various forms, one way or the other. The nationalism that we're seeing in the West today, it fills us with dread because we associate it with the memories of nationalist movements of the 20th century. Fascism, Nazism, socialism, things that made us feel like the Leviathan was creeping up in an insidious and pernicious way to homogenize or consolidate, to iron out and smooth out the differences in societies and take us into or steer us towards a kind of unity that would come at a cost. So I think all of us are very wary of what cost is going to happen, when the other shoe drops, what's going to bring about. But when I think about nationalism, I try, and I also encourage all of you to try to depoliticize nationalism so we can look at it with clear eyes. I take a lot of my understanding of nationalism from one of the definitive texts on the subject, written by a man named Benedict Anderson. He wrote a book called Imagined Communities. And this says a lot about what nationalism has evolved into over many centuries. In the time of the Reformation, it was a binding force for religious communities. In the time of dynasties, nationalism was supported by common languages and legal codes. In the time of the state, we are in the period of statism, which has been going on since the 17th century, but finally saw off its competitors in the form of empire and other dynasties, not really until the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the First World War. So states have emerged from these competing orders and have become the nation, and the nation has become the state. And so we have accepted this hyphenated form of the political unit, the nation state. And so it's evolved and it's taken on many different forms, but it is important to see nationalism as something that is not necessarily coterminous with the state. It is not necessarily a product of the state. Nations are different social organizations than states. The binding forces that we see today are not necessarily expansionist or chauvinist. I think what we're seeing right now in the West is a shared experience voiced in the form of a harsh rebuke against globalization. The migration sweeping across Europe, untrammeled by borders. The trade deals that ultimately didn't deliver on the promises that both parties would get a fair deal and ended up undercutting the value of the labor of many people. The realization that democratic societies became enmeshed in a course of politics and economics that had become disconnected from the will of the people. I think this is what we're witnessing now, but it's not what we've witnessed for all time. So as we consider what nationalism is, try to disconnect it from the current context, which is not invalid. It is very valid and it has assumed a kind of form, but it is not the permanent form. Thank you.
Tom, just before we move to you, Robert, I'd just like to clarify something. Is it a matter of semantics, or would you say we're in a it's difficult to discuss this if the definition of nationalism is really a whole group of people who have a lot in common. They have enough to bind them together that they sort of feel, I won't use the word tribe, but they feel they have a number of, they could tick off a number of elements and they say we all have that. And it might spill over national borders, or it might, you mentioned empires and stuff. Do we have a problem in the 21st century because nation has come to mean geographic borders of legal entities, even as you would say in our country or others, you may have totally different value systems between people within it. Is that are you saying that we got to be careful? It's a problem. Nationalism, coming from the root word nation, maybe has something different. Is a different word than the nation of a geographic legal border. Will you clarify that?
Sure. So in my view, I have never seen the nation as being a permanent fixture with the state. I have seen a coalescing, an overlap between the nation and the state in the 20th century, starting in the 20th century and carrying on in today. But I think what we might be seeing right now is a kind of post-statist form of nationalism, where you have religious groups, transnational constituencies convening around issues of shared concern or shared anger or shared resentment or whatever it may be. But that's what's bringing them together, and it doesn't necessarily necessitate, it doesn't necessitate them being all members of the same state, right? We had seen this in the history of nationalism. We have seen this before, and I think we will see this again. After all, I think a nation is a product of our imagination. It is a social creation. We can walk to the north of where we are right now, and there won't be a big black line that tells us where the United States ends and where Canada begins. That is a product of our imagination. And so too is it with nations.
Okay, so we have to be careful how we use the term.
Absolutely.
Okay, all right. Okay, I just wanted to clarify that. Tom?
Janet, thank you very much. I want to thank Janet and the Minnesota Peace Initiative and the Norway House and all of you for coming out on a cold night. It's really great to see so many people here tonight. I also want to thank Minnesota for making it possible for me to be here. The reason I say that, and this is a true story, before the election, I told my daughter I was coming out to Minnesota. And she said, well, you can't go to Minnesota unless they get the election right, unless they elect the right person. I won't tell you who that was, but let's just say you got it right so I could be here. So thank you very much for letting me be here. But to make it clear, at Plowshares, we support policies, we don't support politicians. And a little bit more about Plowshares. We're a global security foundation based in Washington, D.C. and San Francisco. I'm in Washington. And we're funded by private donations. Today is Giving Tuesday, just to put that out there. All donations are coordinated to fund projects working on nuclear security issues. We raise money primarily out here, out in California, and we give it away to groups primarily in Washington, but also all over the world. And just as an example of that, we just released a new report, 10 big nuclear ideas for the next president that we released in Washington just last week. And for anyone who's interested, this report is on our website, but I also have about 10 copies here for anyone who wants to come up after the event and let me know. I'd be happy to give you one. I also wanted to give a shout out to all of the Twin Cities Plowshares supporters. You know who you are, but including Roger Hale, who's here tonight, a former board chair, longtime board chair of Plowshares. Roger, thank you for coming and all your great work for Plowshares. So I want to get, now enough about me and Plowshares, I want to get to Janet's question about the connection between nationalism and renewed arms race. Certainly I think there is a connection, and I think Robert touched on a fair amount of it, which is that nationalism tends to encourage a me-first thinking. And it tends to undervalue, in my view, global action and cooperative solutions. And as we've been hearing, nationalism is on the rise. And as we can see examples of that across the globe, but we have to, of course, look no further than right here in the United States to see the rise of Trump as an example of nationalism, whether it be putting America first, keeping immigrants out, ripping up agreements with other nations that all have a nationalist flavor. We also can see a rise in Russia, and this, of course, predates Trump, but President Putin in Russia taking over the Crimea, taking over Western Ukraine, trying to make Russia great again. Sounds familiar. Mix that resurgent nationalism with about 10,000 nuclear weapons, and you get a pretty dangerous brew. And I'm going to try to unpack that a little bit. So how and why is that dangerous? In my mind, there are three top dangers of a nuclear Trump. And by and large, we don't know what President-elect Trump will do on nuclear weapons policy because his previous statements have been all over the map, and you can't necessarily say what he's said previously will relate to the future. But having said that, we know that one thing will be true. On January 20th, President-elect Trump will become the president, and he will inherit the codes to U.S. nuclear weapons. And he will have sole authority to use those nuclear weapons as he sees fit. I want to underline this point because it's often assumed that there are checks and balances on this, because in America we have checks and balances on everything, right? You know, you can't build a speed bump without having 6 committee meetings. But in fact, the President of the United States can authorize the launch of U.S. nuclear weapons, at least the ones that are on ready alert, which is about 1,000, in about 4 minutes without any approval of Congress, without any approval of anyone in the administration, without any approval of the Supreme Court. It's up to the president. These are the president's weapons, and it's up to the president's sole discretion. So we have to come to terms with that about whether we feel we can trust President Trump with nuclear weapons. And so, by the way, presumably, can President Putin in Russia or Kim Jong-un in North Korea. So this is not a situation that applies just to us. This situation to me is undemocratic and unconstitutional, that there would be so few people in the greatest democracy in the world, there would be so few people involved in the decision to do what might be the most momentous decision the United States would ever take, which is to initiate nuclear war. What can we do about this? This is one of Ploughshares Fund's highest priorities going forward. There are a couple of things we can do. One of which is to get more congressional involvement in that decision of when and if and how to use U.S. nuclear weapons. And there are members of Congress that are working on this right now. How do we get some level of congressional involvement so it isn't just up to one person, that there has to be some level of communication and deliberation. On the hardware side, there are things we could do. We could take weapons off alert. Many U.S. nuclear weapons, as I said, about 1,000, are on alert moment to moment for immediate use. We could back that off, create more time for deliberation. We could also eliminate ground-based ballistic missiles, which are the ones that are on such high level of alert. You might know this, but in the next state over, North Dakota, there are about 150 ground-based ballistic missiles there on alert right now. Again, another key Plowshares priority. So nuclear Trump danger number 2, President Trump-elect Trump has said he would tear up the Iran nuclear deal when he gets into office. This was a key priority for the Ploughshares Fund back over the last few years, was to get an agreement with Iran to cap and contain its nuclear program. We succeeded in doing that. The Obama administration succeeded in doing that, and we helped. We need to keep that program going, and we need to convince incoming President Trump that it would be a really bad idea to tear this deal apart, because there is no other deal. This is the main game in town. Much better for him to solve other situations, say North Korea, than to unsolve things we've already fixed, like Iran. This will be another major priority of ours. And the third Trump nuclear danger is the new arms race. This is something that takes on sort of special importance now that you have a nationalist leader in both countries, because the dynamic is to respond to threats by the other side by building up your own weapons. It's a very classic Cold War arms race dynamic. And it's fed by the fact that the United States, we are planning to spend about $1 trillion to rebuild the U.S. nuclear arsenal over the next 30 years. Russia has similar plans, not quite that aggressive because they don't quite have that much money. But both sides at the same time are rebuilding their nuclear forces. And you can see the danger there as they start to respond to each other, then those plans get out of hand and get exaggerated. Rather than if you had leaders that were more interested in cooperation, you can imagine them agreeing not to rebuild so much, rebuild less, save money. We don't see that happening. We need to convince President Trump that both leaders will be better off building less. And it may be that as President Trump wants to do things like spend $1 trillion on infrastructure or rebuild the U.S. military, something will have to give. You can't do it all. And we'll have to see where that goes. Not to be too much of a downer, let me give you 2 opportunities that I see as a potential coming out of a Trump administration. One is to take advantage of the fact that you now have 2 leaders, Trump and Putin, who tend to see eye to eye. They have a romance of sorts going on. They seem to really like each other. Okay, they're both nationalistic leaders, but maybe they'll get along in a way that Hillary Clinton and Putin would not have gotten along. Could they strike up a relationship? Could they negotiate a new arms control treaty? It's a well-known fact that Republicans negotiate arms control treaties better than Democrats do. Reagan did it, the 2 President Bushes did it, much more effectively than Clinton or Obama did that. So maybe there's some opportunities there. Or, barring that, Trump could decide to independently reduce U.S. nuclear forces, as President Bush did before him. So there are many options there. On North Korea, President as Trump has said, that he would negotiate with North Korea to contain their nuclear program. That could go really well. It could go really badly, but it's good that he has indicated desire to do that. So we have to see where that is going to go. There are some inconsistencies here, since as president, Trump will need the support of China to do that effectively. Yet at the same time, Trump has said that he wants to work against China on trade policy. So, you know, can you do both those things at the same time? Probably not. So let me wrap this up and just say that the rise in nationalism, particularly in the US and Russia, which happen to be the two largest nuclear states, is a cause of grave concern. And we have to watch the leaders to see where they go on these issues. Certainly, in Trump's case, it's too soon to know what he's going to do on nuclear policy. On the bright side, Trump is an agent of change. He says he wants to change things, drain the swamp. Well, part of that could be changing nuclear policy to do away with Cold War thinking. We'll see. We're keeping an open mind, but we're also getting ready for things to get worse before they get better. Thank you very much.
Tom, I'm going to ask you to start, and actually it's kind of a follow-up to your opening remarks, which is we've touched on the U.S., Russia, and North Korea and Iran, probably the four countries we hear the most about when it comes to nuclear disarmament or nuclear arms race. But would you just give a quick kind of walk around the world for the audience in terms of which nation states have nuclear weapons, and what about this fear of rogue states and stuff? Is it way down here compared to that? I mean, you know, you and I talked a little bit about it before the program in terms of the difference between material versus bombs and stuff. So just give a kind of a quick tour of the world of where they are now, at least.
Sure, the global nuclear tour. It's often, people often ask me, we still have nuclear weapons? Are there still nuclear weapons in the world? The Cold War ended 25 years ago. Well, in fact, we do. The United States and Russia have about 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. About 10 to 15,000, depending on how you count them. Everyone else has way less than that. So, you know, China has a few hundred. Britain and France have a few hundred. India and Pakistan have about 100 each or so. Israel has a similar number. And in terms of the countries that are on the cusp of getting the bomb, Iran was the one that we worried about until President Obama got the nuclear deal last year, so we're hoping that one's solved, again, unless President Trump unsolves it. The main issue today is North Korea, which has nuclear weapons and has ballistic missiles. They don't yet have long enough range ballistic missiles or small enough warheads on those missiles to get over here, but it's only a matter of time. And so we assume that sometime in the first Trump administration, North Korea will reach that goal. So I think one of the first things President Trump will have to do is figure out a diplomatic approach to North Korea. The other danger that's floating out there is the possible terrorist acquisition and use of a nuclear weapon, presumably by stealing one or stealing material for a bomb. You know, there are efforts all across the globe to try to prevent that. Hasn't happened yet, but it could. And then there's the dirty bomb scenario, which is basically a terrorist group getting not nuclear bomb material, but radioactive material, the kind of stuff you might find at your local hospital, putting that on a conventional explosive and blowing it up, which would not nearly be as deadly as a nuclear explosion, but nonetheless would be very scary and very disruptive. So those are kind of the range of threats that we tend to worry about.
Thank you. Robert, we accept your apology because you are right. The political prognosticators were really off the mark. But something you said, which is this rise of nationalism that we're seeing right now, at least in the West, and we haven't talked about other parts of the world, so you may want to also address, is nationalism rising in different parts of the world, but again, as I said, maybe not by borders, but by groups. But is this, as you look back historically, is it almost always the pendulum swings? In other words, do we, in the view of many, move into modernity too fast? Whether it's our digital age or years ago, the industrial, does this almost always happen, that the economy moves into a whole new capability, and it's great for some people, but others get left behind? You know, we certainly have heard of Luddites. And then the pendulum, so does nationalism almost always come after a major new wave of technology, or is it just coincidental this time?
I don't think it's coincidental. It's a good question, because the wave of globalization that we're in the midst of right now also needs to be seen in a broader context, because there was a wave of globalization at the turn of the 20th century in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution. And there is a correlation that we can draw between that and the discord that emerged in Europe afterwards. I don't know if it's entirely owing to socioeconomic factors that we ended up with World War I, but I do think we had similar competing strains of nationhood coming into conflict with each other, and they had been brewing for some time. I think one of the problems that exists in Europe and has never really been resolved ever since the EU project was initiated was how to negotiate the identity with the state and the identity with Europe. This has long been a problem, and I think we're finding out right now is many Europeans have been taken past the point where they could give their allegiance to Europe, and they are returning to their state allegiance. It's going to put at risk the whole European project, and I think we're seeing developments unfold in Italy, we're seeing developments unfold in Spain, obviously in the UK, and in France, Germany. The European project is really under duress now, which is a serious problem. Now, how this connects to the nuclear situation is that, again, not all forms of nationalism are the same, right? So the type of nationalism that we're seeing sweep through Europe right now is not the same nationalism that we've been seeing in Russia and in China and in North Korea for actually quite some time, right? And the weapons have become a kind of tool for them to advance their nationalistic identity to the world and present a kind of, a kind of saber rattling to the rest of the world that they shouldn't be messed with.
Tom, a couple of times, even early in this discussion, there is a thought that at least this nationalism that this election may represent is an anti-establishment. It's sort of a rejection of how the establishment or the elites have kind of run things since World War II, probably. What does that mean for trying to negotiate treaties where, by the very nature of a negotiated treaty, you got to bring multiple parties and you all got to be willing to give a little? And anyway, so would you talk a little bit about how, at least right now, things are done generally in terms of getting a reduction of nuclear weapons, or at least a control of it? And is that out the window? And is it all going to be just personal persuasion between heads of nationalist states? Or how do you think it's going to work, at least for a while?
Sure. I mean, the short answer is we have no idea how Trump will approach, more traditional approaches to global security. Up to now, we've dealt with nuclear dangers through international cooperation to the extent that we can. So, for example, we have the Non-Proliferation Treaty that says which countries can have nuclear weapons and which can't, and basically makes all countries sign up to eventually eliminating those weapons, including the United States. And then we have bilateral treaties between the United States and Russia to reduce their forces. And the US and Russia have reduced their forces by about 80% since the height of the Cold War. Pretty impressive. But we don't know is how Trump feels about those things. We know that, at least he said, he doesn't like the U.S.-Iran agreement to cap and roll back Iran's program. Does that mean he doesn't like the U.S.-Russian treaties? Does that mean he doesn't like the non-proliferation treaty? He has talked about other nations getting the bomb. Well, why doesn't South Korea get the bomb? Why doesn't Japan get the bomb? I think a lot of that's just talk. I'm hopeful that a lot of that was just talk, but we'll see. And so, you know, when we see Trump as a change agent, which he claims to be, he could change things for the better or change things for the worse. He could throw out all of the pre-existing treaties and agreements, which in my mind would be for the worse. Or he could change things by changing what I see is we're still stuck in Cold War thinking about the value of nuclear weapons and their role. And for example, even President Obama, I think, got stuck in Cold War thinking by assuming that we had to rebuild the entire U.S. arsenal to the tune of $1 trillion. We don't have to do that, and Trump, as a change agent, if he wanted to, could rethink that whole process.
Do we, just to follow up, do we know, so for instance, we keep identifying countries becoming more nationalistic. So do we know, is China now saying, we're not going to do anything to help you with North Korea? And is Russia saying to China, if you help the United States and North Korea, we're not? I mean, I'm just trying to, do we know that there's starting to be real pushback from, you know, I'm not blinking till you blink, and therefore nobody's going to talk about it? Or do you think there is a chance to get people still moving towards, you know, working at least, if not in big groups, at least in 1 or 2 or 3 groups?
I think there's at least a possibility that, as I said, Trump and Putin will be able to see eye to eye and work together because they're so similar in many ways. At the same time, we've seen a real move away from cooperative arms control in Russia. And in particular, there's a U.S.-Russian treaty called the INF Treaty that was negotiated under Gorbachev, who was a very internationalist Russian leader. Putin is much less so, and so he's been pulling back support for that treaty. And in fact, President Obama offered to negotiate a new arms reduction treaty with President Putin, and President Putin said no. So we've seen some real anti-globalist approaches, some more nationalistic approaches coming from President Putin of late. That may change, it may not.
One last kind of subset of that. During the, if you want to call it kind of the 60s and 70s, when there was real arms negotiation going on, at least between the United States and Russia. In order to do that, do you generally have to say the only topic we're talking about here is arms negotiation? We are not horse trading about islands off of China that are next to Vietnam, or any, you know, we're not going to trade off Ukraine for, you know, bases in Turkey. Or, I mean, is that the only thing that's going to work? Is to say we just have to get groups, if they're going to negotiate, to say this is the only thing. Otherwise, it's just blackmail. So I mean.
Yes, I mean, I think you have to treat issues as distinct issues and not link them all together. So, for example, clearly the United States and Europe have a problem with the fact that Russia is in the Crimea and Ukraine. If we say we can make no progress on arms control until you get out of those regions, there will be no progress on arms control. If we say we're going to treat those issues separately, then maybe there'll be some opportunity to make progress on arms control. So linking things together tends to be bad for progress. Delinking things tends to be good.
Okay. Robert, will you explain, I don't know if it's on a spectrum, but what's the difference between nationalism and patriotism? I mean, is it one's great, you wave flags and have a 4th of July, and the next is terrible because you don't let immigrants come in the country? I mean, because I'm sure some people would say I'm just being patriotic, and so what's your definition of those, or where's the line, or what's the danger of one, not the other? How do they fit together?
Yeah, it is a good question, and I think it's easy to conflate the two and see that one form of nationalism can be billed as simply being patriotic, and what's wrong with that, right? It is interesting, I really must say, it is interesting to see how these terms have become politicized and the associations that we connect to them. The patriot is noble, the nationalist is something to be feared. In Europe, in the 20th century, the nations spawned a number of so-called national front parties, and these national front parties tended to be hard right and to be even borderline fascist. This is the wing of British politics that is really on the upswing right now. But I see it this way, that what patriotism embodies is a kind of civic nationalism. And civic nationalism embodies lots of good things. We can be nationalistic without being members of the National Front. You can feel a strong affiliation with a nation of people and whatever it may produce in terms of culture or literature, music. There are so many ways that we can affiliate ourselves with nation in positive ways and promote universal values in the process. If you're an American, you'd like to believe that you subscribe to values that are not just applicable to Americans, but they have applicability to lots of people. This is part of the city on the hill trope. Now, nationalism, on the other hand, seems to be associated in a negative light because it invokes a kind of us and them dynamic, right? And the us is often defined by race, by class, ethnicity, and so identity politics weigh in and create tension between groups of people and draw them apart. So in essence, what it's doing is the opposite of what civic nationalism does very well, and that is try to draw people closer together, bind them together under something that's very positive and something that can be promoted, kind of like a face for the world, right? That people can admire. Whereas the ethnic nationalism or the racial nationalism that we're seeing variations sprout up right now tend to be menacing and divisive.
Okay, I have dig a little bit deeper since you're a political scientist. First of all, Tom, I let your comment that it's a cold night pass. But if you ask any Minnesotan, this is a beautiful night in November. I just want you to know that. But
in relation to Washington, it's all relative.
It is relative. But it fits into my question for Robert, because we do get a lot of cold nights here in Minnesota. And I spent one winter, not too long ago actually, because it's a pretty new book, but slogging through Francis Fukuyami's History of Political Organizations, which is really from the time we climbed out of trees, how we have organized ourselves right up to the modern. And it was fascinating that he would say the uniting factor for most of our human history is tribalism. Democracy, in which we try to bring together a wide range of different interest identities and get them all working together as a unit based on what is good for the populace, the civil well-being of the community, as we all know, is relatively new. I mean, it's only been tested about 300 years since the Enlightenment. So you teach political science. Are we in kind of a dangerous time, or is it just a speed bump? Because it's the Western democracies that are starting to have this rise of nationalism. And much of the rest of the world doesn't have democracy yet. I mean, there are a lot of democracies, but they're at really early stages, and they're much closer to the tribal history than we are. So what do you think? I mean, is it a very serious threat to our democracy, or is it really just a little speed bump?
So, and you can take this with a grain of salt, because I've already come out and said I'm wrong, you know, and so I let off with that. I don't know how much credence you want to put into any comments I have from this point forward, but or what I've said so far. I teach a class back in Washington on peace and conflict, and I like to poll my students a lot on their impressions of the world. And I asked them a question one week. I said, what's your interpretation of the way things are right now? Is it things are going great? You know, you feel pretty safe? That's A. B, there are some things to be concerned about, but fixable. Or C, the world is on fire. Most of the students said the world is on fire. And this tells me a couple of things. One, I think there's a lot of justification in that you look around and it seems like the number of threats that are being posed to civilization, humanity, order are more varied than they've ever been. And then the threats are not just varied, but they have enormous and catastrophic capacity, like nuclear weapons, and nuclear weapons falling into the wrong hands. The other thing that strikes me about this is the way that this generation coming up sees the world right now, and I can't help feeling like it's going to be a very strange thing for me to have to explain to a generation of students who have never lived through 9/11 the significance of 9/11, right? They have no memory of it. In fact, the students I have now have almost no memory of it because they were 6 years old. So I take a lot from that, and a lot of our sense of security in the world, much like nationalism and other interpretations of what is real, are our own constructions. We if we feel that there is a viable threat out there, then we will respond accordingly. If we had some perspective and we're able to step back from that threat and maybe see it with a different set of eyes, we might act differently. But we can only go with what our filter will allow us to see and not see at any given time. So right now, I think, generally speaking, there's a lot of uncertainty and tension about, our security, internationally, and I think it's well founded. I do. We're already kind of taking this in a dour direction, right? I don't mean to make it worse and throw more cold water on it on a temperate night, but that's the way I'm seeing it.
I'm going to ask each of our speakers one more question directed at both of them. So if you would, I don't know if we already started to collect questions, but the best questions come from the floor. So get your questions in. And Rachel, we're going to collect them down the aisles and they'll bring them up. And I will go through them and ask questions of our panelists. I mentioned that one of our topics of a previous program was the impact of social media on world events. And it was a fascinating program, and we learned a lot. And I'm just thinking here as you're talking, part of the rise of nationalism is a little bit of anti-modernity, whether it's ISIS anti-modernity, whether it's much of the Western world feeling left out by globalization, whatever it is. So there's a little bit of anti-modernity as the catalyst for this. But I also, Tom Friedman is from our hometown here, and his term of the earth is flat. In each of you, how do you think social media, the ability of people anywhere in the world to connect with each other, will influence or could influence your areas? For instance, maybe it's not true, but we certainly get the impression that on the internet, you can learn how to build a nuclear bomb. You can learn how you can reach out in the dark part of the internet and find fissure material. I mean, the point is, if you want to, you can go almost anywhere and get almost anything for good or bad. And with regard to nationalism, if nationalism is an identity and not necessarily a border, then it's a lot easier for the grumpy people of the world to get together, or the, any particular group, and become, sort of an anti-force to the statehood. So either of you, how do you think it could influence either the success or the failure of in your particular area?
I'll give this a go. So, clearly, if nuclear weapons fell into the hands of a non-state actor, this would be an enormous game changer, wouldn't it? Because then all the rules are out the window. What we rely on right now are that states are going to use them responsibly. It's responsible, whatever you consider responsible management of nuclear weapons, but there's a certain kind of maturity that a state has to exhibit when they are in the possession of nuclear weapons, that they're not just going to use them capriciously or haphazardly or fire them at anybody, because the price to pay for that is their own destruction, right? A second strike capability is going to come back and get them. Now, if you are a non-state actor, you have no territory, you are dispersed, horizontally organized, maybe not even that large as a constituency, but you've managed to come up with a nuclear weapon. This does away with all those rules. Now, what's on the positive side of this ledger, though, is that going nuclear is enormously prohibitive in terms of cost and in terms of technology. Yes, you're right that on the web we can do a great many things. Bill Nye the Science Guy, I don't think he's gotten that far yet in telling us how to build a nuclear weapon. Maybe he even knows how, and he just won't tell us. But I do know that obtaining some fissile material is very hard, and it's very expensive. And we know from the Iranian experience recently that it takes years to develop the capacity to do this. One interesting intersection between nationalism and nuclear weapons is Iran, because what we know about Iran is that there is a deep divide within that population about whether or not Iran should be nuclear at all. There's a very large younger portion of that population which doesn't sympathize as strongly with the principles of the revolution, and are asking themselves, why do we hate America so much? I haven't had a chance to think for myself on this point. And so even if Iran did go nuclear, would there be a strong, nationalistic position behind that to sustain it? I don't know. Does it even matter? I think it does. I think it does. Because without that, I think that, a project like that looks pretty hollow and will probably not go very far, although it did get very far in Iran until the nuclear deal. I'll hand it over to you.
Well, I didn't mean to pick just on getting the nuclear bomb. Yeah. Social media as a way for nationalist subgroups all over the world to connect with each other. Do they fuel each other? Do they reinforce each other? We know the world of tweets, you now have the ability to reach everybody at any hour of the day with your thoughts and your desires. So anyway, I was just curious how even just the nationalist movement around the world, is it being fueled by the very technology, or is it being enabled, I guess, by the very technology that they kind of say they don't like what it's doing? So.
Yeah. Well, I think that there's a lot to that. I would be cautious not to generalize the sympathies that nationalist movements have for each other, because, again, I think they do this for lots of different reasons. On the other hand, the example of ISIS is a pretty undeniable one. There was a very interesting, eye-opening report which came out a couple years ago, generated by the Brookings Institution on it was a census of ISIS activity and on Twitter and social media. And it had astounding numbers on its ability to recruit from the West, how many actors were affiliated with ISIS, and they were online, and they were able to be quite effective at recruiting using that tool. So they were able to project an identity that drew a lot of sympathy and and it recruited many people. So in that sense, I think you could say it was a success. But I don't know if I would go so far to say that social media is creating an opportunity for, all the nationalist movements of the world to come into contact with each other and join forces, unless they have a clearly defined enemy that I think they share in common. I think that would be the thing. But I don't think social media is a sine qua non of that relationship.
Yeah. Okay. Tom, what do you think about the internet and just the ability to reach anywhere in the world to do anything?
Well, just on the broader point, it's been said before, but it bears repeating that, FDR was the president that mastered the radio. And then you had JFK, who mastered television. Obama mastered the internet. Trump mastered Twitter. And reality TV. And how many of you heard about Twitter 5 years ago and said, what is that? That's not going to go anywhere. It's the main way the President of the United States will communicate with everybody will be through Twitter. And it's just amazing. All the news that comes out about Trump is through his Twitter account. Now, just in terms of the general sort of widespread nature of information, I think it cuts both ways. Yes, the basic recipe for nuclear weapons is well known, by and large. But as Robert said, you still have to get the materials, and it's still hard to do. At the same time, because there's so much information out there, for example, satellite photographs and all this kind of thing, it's easier for average citizens to see what governments or non-state actors are up to. So I think the general information explosion can be used for good or bad.
Okay. The first one is for you, Tom, and it goes right to North Korea. But it comes from the side of China is right next door. Japan's across the sea, but China's right next door. Why doesn't China, or does China, tell us a little bit more about how China feels about a increasing nuclear capability on its doorstep, and doesn't it have a sense of it's got to do something about it or work with others? So just explain a little of the China-North Korea situation.
Yeah, it's a great question because it's sort of puzzling. Because on the one hand, China is pretty much North Korea's only trading partner. So if China wanted to shut down North Korea's nuclear program, they could. At the same time, it's a higher priority for China to make sure that North Korea does not cease to exist, right? China's highest priority is to maintain a buffer zone between South Korea and China. So from China's perspective, the regime of North Korea must stay. So if we could find a way to remove the bomb of North Korea but keep the regime of North Korea, China would be happy with that. Problem is that North Korea, as a regime, wants the bomb and isn't willing to give it up. So I think the negotiating space here is, can the Trump administration work with China and South Korea and Japan and North Korea to find a way to say to North Korea, look, we're not out to do you in. We're not out for regime change. You can stay there, and that'll keep China at the table and North Korea. But to say, we want to freeze your nuclear program before you have a missile that can reach across the ocean to us with a nuclear warhead on it. And we still have time to do that, but we have to start now.
Okay. Robert, this is a question that could keep us here all night, and we're not going to do that. So just a shorter version. But it's a good question. How much of this nationalism rise is really the result of economic injustice? I mean, is the way to counter or not combat, but the way to manage and downplay this need for nationalism to create greater economic stability in the countries where it's rising? Again, that could be an all-night dissertation, but do you see that this whole question of economic income disparity is the root of some of the rise of nationalism?
Sure. Just to recap the details of Brexit. It was 53 leave, 47 remain. Of the 53 who wanted to leave, the lion's share of that vote, the vast majority of that vote, came from outside London, outside the urban centres. Wales, not Scotland, interestingly, so there's a future there that has to be unfolded. And the north, the rural, traditionally agricultural, mining, manufacturing centers of the country that have probably borne the greatest brunt of loss in terms of industry. So I think there's a lot that can be said about the resentment, the politics of resentment that are fueling the new nationalism as we're seeing it in the West right now. In fact, there's a book of that title called The Politics of Resentment, but it doesn't deal with Brexit, it deals with Wisconsin, of all places, and I recommend it. It's an excellent book. Catherine Kramer is her name. And so it deals a lot with the socioeconomic factors, but isn't it interesting, and I don't mean to like fan any flames here, but isn't it interesting that these places tend to be the ones that are in least contact with people who are different from they are, right? And it's the cities, the places that have the highest concentration of an integrated population, of diversity, of various cultures meshing, even though they have their problems, obviously. They are the ones that favor the continuation of this liberal project. So yes, I think socioeconomic resentment is there, but I also think that there is a strong undercurrent of fear. I think the American electorate responded to that fear here when it came to immigration and wall building. That's there too. How do I break that down into more concrete terms? I'm not sure. But in my mind, it's undeniable that they both play a significant role.
Tom, one of our audience members has been listening to you carefully. Since you have a number of things that, with the new president-elect, where it could either go this way or that way. So the question is, how do you think you or others from Plowshares or others in the nuclear disarmament community, have you got any ideas of how you're going to approach President-elect? Do you have any inroads yet? And the question is, have you considered using Twitter yourself as a means of communicating? So but it's a very practical question. I mean, we can all sit and say, what if? But the real question is, how are you going to get the ear and the access you're going to need?
It's a great question. I wish I knew the answer. I have no idea. We did an event to release this new report we did on 10 big nuclear ideas for the next president. And we said, well, we should, and this was just after the election, we said, well, we should invite someone from the Trump administration, someone on the transition team. We couldn't find any phone. We couldn't reach out to the transition team because they're sort of undefined, amorphous. That'll change over time, but I would have to say that it's a real challenge for us because certainly the people that are being named to the administration are not people that we tend to hang out with. So at the same time, so traditionally when groups like ours, like Plowshares, go into opposition mode, I mean, right, we were very friendly, not on all issues, but we worked very closely with the Obama administration on the Iran deal, for example, the New START treaty, opposed the Obama administration on their $1 trillion program to build new nuclear weapons, but generally tried to work with the administration. Depending on what the Trump administration does, we may go into opposition mode, which is that we work with elements of Congress where we have, affinity, and we have to go outside of Washington. I mean, I really think we need to do a fair share of movement building whatever that means. We can no longer just stay in Washington, which is why I'm so happy to be here tonight, because this is the kind of thing we need to do. Is get out of D.C., talk to people, and build a movement that sends messages back into Congress about what we want. This is certainly not going to be the nuclear freeze movement, but it was Senator Markey who was giving a talk the other day and said, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Things tend to come around that sound a lot like what they happened before. And when Reagan came into office, he was all about the Cold War, rebuilding U.S. forces. And then the nuclear freeze movement made him realize that he had to be more than that. He had to have other dimensions. And that's where the arms control efforts came from later in his administration. Now, it's a very different day. We're not going to have a nuclear freeze movement, but we need some kind of movement that isn't in Washington to send the message to Trump, for example, that we're worried about you with your finger on the button. We need you to do things to reassure us that you're not going to use that power. We need to create that movement because today it doesn't exist.
Can I come in on that point, if I may, to breaking out of Washington, right, and getting out there with a message, movement building, informing population. This is all happening in a context where foreign affairs as a subject matter that is really weighing on the minds of American people ranks relatively low, right? So you've got to overcome that to get them to appreciate the severity, the gravity of the situation when it comes to nuclear weapons. And that's, I think, one of the components of the outreach has to be, okay, number one, we need to really care about America's role in the world and the range of threats that face America and how this president is going to handle those threats. Will he handle them capably? And so kind of leading off with that conversation, get people to care about foreign affairs. And this is where I see my role also as being quite important here, is that those who have the knowledge and the perspective on being able to explain the world and make sense of it, even though we may not be able to tell you what's going to happen, we can tell you what is happening now or what has happened in clear terms and as clear language as possible. Get people to really appreciate and identify with the litany of complexities that are out there right now that face us in the international realm. Well,
in terms of, first of all, we're glad you got out of Washington. Welcome on this beautiful night. But I and many people in the audience grew up in the late 60s, where many of the great movements began on college campuses, or at least they certainly were amplified to the extent of making change on college campuses. And we've come through a bad recession, and I think young people have worried for 10 years on where do I get a job. But the economy is improving and stuff. In each of your areas, do you have any, I hate to use the word polling after this last election, but any insight as to where the younger generation is, let's say under 30, millennials? Do they suddenly wake up and say, wait a minute, I don't want this to be Germany in the 30s? Or do they wake up and say, I don't want nuclear bomb ending my life? Do they, you talk about getting people to recognize the situation. Where do you think millennials and young people are on either of these topics right now?
I'll just start with some anecdotal information. A lot of polling was done during the election, some of which wasn't useful and some of which was. You heard Secretary Clinton talk a lot about Trump's finger on the button, and you heard President Obama talk a lot about Trump's finger on the button. That wasn't an accident. They did polling that told them that that was something that people were particularly concerned about. And so that was an issue that actually has brought nuclear weapons as an issue to the fore in a way that has not been for many, many years. At Plowshares, we've been trying to expand on that and use that as an opening to have a broader debate about nuclear policy. We were assuming that if Secretary Clinton were to be elected, that issue would go away because there wasn't the same concern about Secretary Clinton with nuclear weapons, although the issues are the same. One silver lining of the incoming Trump administration is that issue will be with us in spades. And so can we capitalize on the concern that already exists out there about Trump and nuclear weapons combined to bring young people into the movement anew? That is the challenge that we face, and we're certainly committed to using that issue at the same time as trying to organize in a way that appeals to younger generations.
And you're on a college campus, so.
Yeah. Well, let me give you some interesting numbers on this, at the risk of being wrong again. The exit polling for this demographic, this is 18 to 29, across the country, 83% of African Americans voted for Hillary Clinton. 70% of Latinos voted for Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump carried white millennials, we're talking 18 to 29-year-olds, by a margin of 48 to 43. I think this is something that we should take notice of. It tells us, one, they're not unified as a generation on our current politics. They're responding to different messages, and race and identity are very much a factor in this generation that was supposed to be the post-racial generation.
Well, I hate to go right from that cheery thought to to another one, but we have a question, and I think it's a fair one, and it's certainly for you, Robert. Looking at history, just looking at the 20th century and the rise of fascism in the 20th century, is there any lessons that you can draw and share with us as you know, Franco and Mussolini and Hitler all rose to power? Are there signposts like, if we get to this point, you know, it's rhyming. May not be repeating, but it's rhyming. What did we learn, and what are some of the signs that we as a population should not just sit idly by? That's the question, is what things, if we see them, should we, you know, start to get alarmed and say, we've got to get more engaged?
It is so easy to forget what we've been through in the past. I heard some recent stories about nationalist sentiment in Spain and the nostalgia for the Franco regime coming back, right? And it's astounding to me to think that there would be a population in this country still harboring the days of a dictator who ruled ruthlessly for 40 years. But that's the case right now. I think that this is an indication of you know, populations that are just really unhappy with the way things are, looking for answers. And you know, I think this is also true in Russia, that you've got a lot of nostalgia for the way things were. I think Vladimir Putin leads that charge and exploits it, and is able to maintain his support on the idea that that you know, Russia can be great again, right, on the same order as its Soviet predecessor. So I don't know if there's any kind of lesson there in the sense of like how we can prevent this kind of thing from recurring again, because I don't think, you know, when a whole population, you know, develops this kind of mindset and wants there to be a result, that's very difficult to turn back. And I'm not going to, you know, pontificate on how to turn that back. What I will say, though, is I think the first stage in opening the door for that kind of sentiment to return or to come in the first place is our memory. When we do forget what was lost, what was sacrificed, and how hard it was under different circumstances. That there were circumstances that were worse than the ones that we're in today, but these are the ones that people know, and it's very difficult to tell people that what they're experiencing is not hard or not difficult. So.
I just have 2 more questions here. A lot of good questions. We're just trying to manage the time so we have time for people to talk to you afterwards as well. But Tom, this is a question for you, and again, fascinating or scary, it just depends upon how you look at it. What is the risk of cyber war? What is the, and let's start with what is the ability of anybody through cyber warfare to get to the codes or get, I mean, that's kind of the ultimate, or just less than that, cyber warfare creating a situation in which then we respond. I mean, just that whole area of, I think the whole country's aware of, or the whole world is aware of the risk of all our information, so.
It's a great question, and it's one that hasn't been explored nearly enough. Is the risks of nuclear weapons with cyber insecurity, and it's often said again that either people know they're being hacked or they are being hacked and they don't know it. There's nothing in between. I think with nuclear weapons, it's hard because you ask the government, the U.S. government anyway, are our nuclear weapons secure from cyber attack? And the answer is yes, no problem. You ask experts that have been outside of the government for a while, for example, General Cartwright, who used to be head of U.S. Strategic Command, he would say, no, we have real problems here. And we particularly have problems with land-based ballistic missiles, because those are the weapons that are online, ready to go in a moment's notice. Those are the ones that have to be linked up in some way to a communications system. Our other nuclear weapons, say on submarines are pretty well contained, in their own undersea bubble. Nuclear weapons on airplanes are not on alert. They're not actually loaded on a day-to-day basis. So it's the land-based ballistic missiles that we have a problem that we have to worry about. Another reason, in our opinion, to phase those weapons out. There's another aspect to this, which is, and that kind of hacking can be individual to state, it could be state to state. The other piece that worries me is the state-to-state stuff that the U.S. does to other countries like Russia. My assumption is that the United States government is better at hacking than any other government. Maybe not better than any individual you find in a basement, but better than any other government. And so we are probably doing a lot more to hack into Russia's nuclear systems than anybody else, and more than Russia is doing back the other way. So the danger is rather counterintuitive. From a U.S. general's perspective, wouldn't you love something such that when the Russians push their button, nothing happens? As a U.S. general, wouldn't you think that's great? Okay, but then wait a minute. As the Russian general who knows you're doing that, what does that say to the Russians? That before there's a crisis, they better use their weapons, because in a crisis, the U.S. is going to do something with cyber to make the Russian weapons inoperable. So you can quickly see that's a very destabilizing situation. In a counterintuitive way, you want both sides to have perfect surety that when they use their weapons, they will go. So cyber adds a whole level of uncertainty to that, which in my view is very destabilizing, and both governments are doing it, but we haven't even figured out to have that conversation, much less what's the right answer.
Tom, I'm just going to ask you a quick follow-up question, not to that one, but I think this could be answered in a really quick, short answer. Again, this gets to the practical, where do we go from here? How realistic is it to democratize or to get more people involved in the button question? And again, I'm not, not to just fall back on cliches, but do you really want Congress to be in this? I mean, that's the questioner's question, is it a good thing? I mean, the high risk of one person doing it is, of course, the high risk of a person doing it. The other is it's going to get done promptly and in time to save everybody, maybe. But so do you really want it democratized? Could it be done in a way, maybe very quickly, that would work? Obviously, you've thought that through, so since you proposed it.
Yes, I mean, I think it could be. It's the reason why only the president is the sole decision maker is because speed is priority over decision making and thinking it through. But it doesn't have to be that way anymore. we used to have the speed as the element because if Russian warheads were coming over here, we felt we had to launch before the weapons landed, so it had to be instantaneous. But if we had forces just on submarines, for example, you know, those weapons could land first, and then we could decide whether we wanted to respond. I mean, it's an awful thing to consider, but there's no reason why the United States has to launch on a moment's notice before the Russian weapons get here. If the Russian weapons are coming over, they're going to land anyway, as awful as that sounds. So we can actually take the time to deliberate what we're going to do. And once you have that time window, yes, let's bring in Congress. To me, the more deliberation there is, the better decision you're going to get.
Okay, this is our last question, and it's for both of you. And interestingly, it has to do with the fact that you both live in D.C. Good question, though. Some of the richest zip codes in the country are in D.C. and the areas around there. And the question is, we've been at war for 15 years. Military contractors do very well in wars. And you guys have been in this business a long time from different perspectives. The old adage, follow the money. Whether it's a nuclear arms race, whether it's nationalism, is there at the root of it somebody's going to make money off of this, and therefore they've got a reason to wrap themselves in either nationalism or defending the country? So how much is money and who makes money at it influence either one of these topics?
I love getting like the first chance to answer these really easy questions. These are softballs, Janet.
We have a smart audience.
I know, especially now that I have to disclose, my connections to, various defense contract. No, I mean, yes, there are wartime economies. We if anyone is doing very well with, military purchasing and, the need for boots on the ground and provisioning and weapon systems and developing even better weapon systems, it's the military-industrial complex, yes. So is Washington doing very well with this? Yes. Is this something that's just happening now? No. Eisenhower was the first to really raise this as a salient issue back in the 1950s. But I think to the broader point of government, that we've seen a lot of economic growth in the D.C. area. It sustained the property crash pretty nicely. It didn't really suffer the harsh bottoming out of the job market at all, really. I mean, it did pretty well. So D.C. is kind of insulated to this, and I think part of the popular sentiment out there now about D.C. is that it needs to feel what the rest of the country is feeling. But to undo all that, I think is both not as simple as it seems, nor is it necessarily in the interest of the United States. I think for those who think, we need to have a smaller government or have D.C. kind of wake up to what's going on, smell the coffee, most of those people would probably still be in favor of having a pretty strong military and having a well-funded defense. So I think it has less to do with large or small. It has just kind of reallocating resources from one area of government to the other. I don't think we're going to see a shrinking of government. I don't think we're going to see a shrinking of deficit. It's going to remain, and that's a more complicated thing to undo. It's going to take a very long time.
I agree, and just from the vantage point of nuclear weapons, I mean, I have no doubt that one of the main reasons why the nuclear infrastructure, the nuclear enterprise, if you will, has continued for so long and is now about to be reborn in new form is because of the money disparity. Those of us who are working to reduce nuclear weapons and reduce nuclear risks are working with, on any given year, maybe $10 million, okay, let's say. Then you look at the forces that have an interest in perpetuating nuclear weapons, Okay, now you're talking about the whole military infrastructure, the defense contractors, and that's, billions of dollars a year. The United States spends roughly $30 billion a year on the nuclear program. So we're completely dwarfed by that amount of money, and that money talks, right? Those are people testifying to Congress on why we need nuclear weapons. Those are corporations giving donations, campaign contributions to their members of Congress, saying, and there are real jobs at stake, too. So, I don't take this lightly. And there are jobs at stake in North Dakota, right next door, Montana, Wyoming, where not much else is going on, to be quite honest. And it's not just Republicans, it's bipartisan. There is bipartisan support for maintaining these jobs and this infrastructure. So it's a huge influence. I would say it's the defining quintessential thing that has made progress so difficult.
Thank you very much. Usually I ask on any program our speakers to give us some sense of optimism at the end. Do either one of you want to throw something out? It's not required, but when I heard this statistic about the young people, then I kind of thought there's no answer there. So, any optimism anywhere?
I think I probably said this before, but I think we need to learn from this election, and certainly we at Plowshares are learning from this election that we need to do things differently. We need to think different. We need to act different, talk different, get out of Washington more, and that's part of what this is all about. So I think if we use this as a wake-up call to think differently about what the American people need and want, we'll get to a better place. It might take a while, but we have to start somewhere. And I'll also say that, the incoming Trump administration is about change. Right? It's not really clear what kind of change, but if there's any overarching theme about this election, it's change. Change from what we had before. Is there a way that we can impress upon incoming President Trump what kind of change we want and how to change things? I think that's the opportunity that we need to make happen.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you all very much. I want to thank our speakers. Remember, I warned you, you might not be leaving here feeling any safer or more secure, but at least you now know more about the threat. So, Tom and Robert, I'd like to thank you very much for getting out of Washington and coming to the middle part of the country, and we appreciate it, and we'd like to give you a big round of applause. As a token of our appreciation, we have a very special gift that we have handmade for every one of our program participants. And don't worry, you don't have to get it through TSA. We'll mail it to you. So, but these are American Indian sacred pipes. And we think, as we said earlier, our Norwegian roots are based in peace and peacemaking. This pipe is called by some people a peace pipe. I did until last year, until one of our audience participants, who was a Native American, came up and said to me, "It's awfully nice that you do this, but you might want to do a little more research." And in doing it, I found out that we, the white people, like to call them peace pipes. But the American Indian, the Native Americans, call them sacred pipes because they're very important in the healing process. Now, as part of treaty negotiation, many Indian members would bring them with them, and you can see where we, on the other side of the table, turn that into peace pipes, but they're really known as sacred pipes. But I think we've had a lot of reference to the election, we've had a lot of reference to problems around the world, and the idea that this is a really important part of a healing process, I think, is even more apropos. So we present these to you. They're made from Minnesota pipestone. That is the stone of this particular model, and we have the father of the young man who makes the pipes, actually made you your own personal box with a brass plate on it for tonight's program. So I think in both of your offices, I know you're going to be out in Middle America all the time, but on your office cadenza, I think you can put your sacred pipe. So we will mail them to you, but they are a small token of our appreciation for tonight. So thank you very much. Before you leave, I'd also like to thank Sue Drugemiller, who is the chairman of our events committee, and our whole committee members and group that plan this group. So I'd like to give a big round of applause to all of our committee members. And any of you who are here can stand. And I also will invite any of you who are interested in joining the committee, please feel free to do so. We'd love to have you. A little bit like people who move to Minneapolis, they don't think they're going to like it, but once they get here, they never leave. Our committee's getting bigger and bigger every year because we have a lot of fun. We plan the programs and we celebrate a lot, and it's a great committee to be on. So anybody who's interested, we'd love to hear from you. I'd also like to thank the leadership and the board of the Norway House. And I encourage all of you to look at the website for the Norway House. You can find out upcoming events and a lot about the Norway House. But most importantly, you will learn that we are building a new, beautiful facility. We currently have a lovely one on Franklin, but we're building a new one. And a really important part of that is going to be a big meeting room, a gathering room for meetings like this. And so I encourage all of you who haven't to think about contributing to building of the Norway House. We love the University of Minnesota, but we can't wait to have our own home. And I will tell you, for any upcoming events at the Norway House, and this is really important, and you could never say this about any place in Washington, D.C., there is great parking. You can just park right next to it and walk in. So, in particular, many of you may have seen, there's been a lot of publicity in the last week or so. There's a great presentation right now called Gingerbread Wonderland, and it's beautiful and it's gotten a lot of attention. So it's a great holiday tradition to develop for yourself and your family. So I encourage you to do that. I would like to thank Jan Peterson. Are you here? Or has he left? Jan Peterson is the president of the. There he is. Yeah, I wondered. There you are. In the shadow over there. But he's a big man with a big job because he has not only the chairman of the board, but he must have been missing at one meeting, and he is also the chairman of the campaign to raise money for the Norway House, the capital campaign. So we appreciate it very much. And I know we have a number of board members here from the Norway House. You had a board meeting here earlier this afternoon. So again, thank you all for your support of the Minnesota Peace Initiative. And finally, I would just like to thank all of you. We couldn't do these programs and learn as much as we do about what's going on in the world if it wasn't for you. So I encourage you to, if this is your first program, I hope you will come again. If you are a regular, thank you very much. We will be having another program early in the spring. Again, for those of you who are here for the first time, we do 2 programs a year, spring and fall, and we always pick a topic right out of the news and bring you the very best experts we can find on that topic, as we did tonight. So I hope we see all of you next spring, and we really, really appreciate it. And I would like you to know you are invited to come up and speak to our guests here. I didn't get to all your questions, we never do, but if you have any particular questions you'd like to give to our panelists, I'm sure they'd be glad to take a few minutes and talk to you.
And I have 10 of these reports for the 10 lucky people to come and talk to me first.
Yes. Okay, so Robert, Tom, thank you very much. And I want to thank you and also tell you that it's really just Washington envy that drives some of those questions. So anyway, safe travels to all of you, and thank you very much.